This week's episode might be one of the favorite ones that I've recorded because we discuss issues that, frankly, I hadn't really thought of before. I knew they were a thing, but I didn't really know how much of a thing they were. So, my conversation is with Atay Kozlovski. He's a visiting research fellow at Delft University of Technology, and he talks about what he calls digital duplicates. Now, you and I all know about deepfakes. You can deepfake the president, you can deepfake a friend, you can deepfake an ex, and get into some real mischief. And so, when he talked about digital duplicates, I just thought, so you're talking primarily about deepfakes, right? And that's part of the conversation, but there's so much more to it, and it raises such interesting ethical, metaphysical questions. So, for instance, what about the fact that we can create deepfakes or we can create recreations of loved ones? Usually, deepfakes are in order to deceive people, but what about someone who is intentionally, knowingly creating a digital duplicate of someone that they love but they've lost? Is that okay so they can continue to interact with that person? Is it okay if we have a child interact with a digital duplicate of someone who's dead? Is that good for them? Is that really bad for them? How are we supposed to figure that out in anything like an ethical way? What does it mean for you and I to consent to being digitally duplicated after we die? Is it the kind of thing for which we need to consent? And how can we consent if we don't really know what our digital duplicate is actually going to wind up saying? Do we have to figure out the guardrails around which we authorize our digital duplicate to be used? Is this like another thing that we need to include in our will? So there's so many interesting questions, including things like, can you be harmed after you die? So this is a philosophical question, ethical question that's been around for a very long time, since at least Aristotle. Aristotle wrote about it. And you might think intuitively, no, once you're dead, that's it. You can't actually be harmed after that. But couldn't your privacy be violated if someone reads your secret diaries that you didn't want them to read? Or if you're an author and they read the books that you never wanted published and then they go off and they publish them? Let's say your likeness is used in a court hearing to say that the person who killed you actually should be forgiven or something like that, or treated with compassion. That's actually a real life case that just happened. So there's just these deep, interesting questions about, can you be harmed after you die by virtue of, for instance, your digital duplicate getting up to some mischief that you wouldn't have approved of? Does that actually harm you and make you worse off, even though you're already dead? Something is going on here. It seems like your rights can be violated, even though you're already dead. So really interesting conversation. Again, wide-ranging, digital duplicates, deep fakes, the grief industry, we talk about that and how the grief industry is using it. Anyway, there's just so much here. So you can see that I'm excited for you to listen to it. It was exciting for me to have. And that's it. If you want to talk to me or email me at em@readblackman.com, you can subscribe to my Substack at readblackman.substack.com. And I don't know, that's it. Who cares? Let's go talk to Atay. It's such a good conversation. Atay, you work on deepfakes, and everyone knows that deepfakes are a big problem. We see them in cybersecurity fraud. We see them with revenge pornography. There's all sorts of ways that deepfakes present a problem. But from what I gather, you think that deepfakes are the tip of the iceberg, or they're one kind of thing that you call digital duplicates. So do I have that right? Can you explain what you mean by digital duplicates and what else is out there other than deepfakes?
Yeah, thanks. The reason I think deepfakes are the most known is like what you mentioned now. The harms are clear. These are getting a lot of attention in the media. In my work, I try to look at this phenomena as part of a wider technological development. So what I've been working on recently is trying to understand different types of applications, which are kinds of deepfakes, but shouldn't be categorized as such. So what do I mean by that? Essentially, if you try to think of what is a digital duplicate, maybe we should start with that. So you might think an AI companion, an avatar, an AI girlfriend or boyfriend. What I'm focusing on are like a subsection of that. So it's these specific duplicates or recreations, attempts to capture a real human person in digital form. So a deepfake is the classic example. That's the paradigmatic example. But in my research and what I'm concerned with, we're seeing a lot of other types of use cases that are not getting enough attention. And a lot of what I focus on is trying to understand what are those sort of under discussed issues that are going under the radar and people are not noticing them, but will have fundamental impacts on our society, on norms of behavior, and so on and so forth. So one example might be, for instance, the impact that we're seeing on recreating interactions with lost loved ones. So often when we think of deepfakes, or like you mentioned, revenge pornography and these types of things, it's usually focused on harming someone else. But we're seeing a lot of
Yeah.
uses where people are trying to embrace this technology. And one
Yeah.
of the biggest areas in which this is being developed is in the grief sector, where people are
Mm.
trying to capture something of a lost loved one in order to keep that bond alive. And that sort
Yeah.
of doesn't exactly fall into that category of deepfakes. And that's why I think this is
Yeah.
a much wider phenomenon.
Yeah, I guess deepfakes are meant to be deceptive. Whereas the kinds of duplicates you're talking about, there's no intention to deceive. It's usually the people who are creating them are precisely the ones who are using them because they want to reconnect. And actually, it's been years since I saw the episode, but there's a Black Mirror episode about this, right? The woman she's a widow, right? And you're nodding. She creates a physical and somewhat mental duplicate of her dead husband, who I think he died in a truck accident or something along those lines, or a car crash.
Yeah, they even have a
And
kid together.
with the duplicate?
No, they have a kid, and the kid sort of
Oh.
part of the episode also talks about the relationship between the child and the
Oh,
duplicate
I don't
father
remember
that
that.
comes up.
Oh,
Yeah.
God, yeah. And so yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm saying the ending of that episode is very funny because they keep the duplicate alive in the attic because they realize
Yes.
that they can only have minimal contact with it, and they send the child up there to talk with the father. Very weird ending, yeah. Like all
So,
Black Mirror episodes.
yeah, of course, that would be a Black Mirror episode. So is part of your work looking at the sort of ethical impacts of that or the social impacts of such a thing? Because that's creepy as shit, right? I don't know that I'm a professional ethicist, and yet my most immediate professional diagnosis is to say that's creepy as shit. Is it just creepy? Is it ethically objectionable? Are there particular values at stake here when we think about these kinds of things? That there's maybe something around the value of grieving or the utility of grieving instead of trying to replace it? What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think it's difficult to put one title to what's wrong with these or should we be afraid of. Yeah. What I'm trying to do is really evaluate these instances on a case-by-case basis. What I did recently was try and, first of all, make sense of the field in general. How do we look at all these different types of use cases and start making sense of them, categorizing them into different groups? And one of the challenges that I've been working on is, how do we do that? And I've proposed my own taxonomy. We can go into that if you'd like. But how do we make sense of these multiple phenomena, right? Some of them are in grief. Others are related to business practices. Some are related to entertainment. So a huge variety. And then the ethics of it, which comes into play afterward, is really drilling down into each of these categories and seeing what are the most common types of issues or challenges that might come up. And they can be ethical. They can be legal. They can be also psychological. So it's a multidisciplinary perspective. And of course, the technical side also comes in because we're using really sophisticated technology, sometimes beyond the understanding of the users. So they're playing around with something they don't really get or don't understand how it works. And so that poses some challenges as well. Yeah, I think because it's such a new field, we're trying at this point to make sense of a lot of this. And that's why I said that we're starting real with, how do you even categorize these objects, entities, instances, cases? Yeah.
So I would take it that the methodology is something like, okay, first categorize. Let's get all this sort of carved up in the right kind of way. And then we could ask, I take it, two kinds of questions. The first question is going to be, are there something like ethical concerns, social concerns, legal concerns, or whatever that obtain across the board, no matter the use case you're talking about? It's just, this is for all cases of digital duplicates. I don't care if it's entertainment or business or therapy or whatever it is. These are the ethical things you really need to think about, or the legal things you really need to think about. And then I take it after that, it's, now let's ask if there are use case specific ethical concerns. Are there things in the grieving category, grieving digital duplicates, that are ethical concerns that don't apply in, say, the business context or something along those lines? Is that the overall methodology?
Yeah, in a sense, I would say it's even the first aspect of what you described, like the general concerns. It's a question of how much focus you want, what high level or low level, right, of a resolution you're looking at.
Yeah.
Let me give examples of a high level one and then maybe a more nuanced one. So we might ask, for instance, about creating duplicates of the deceased. And we might say, this is a huge category, a lot of different use cases, memorializing, continuing bonds, historical figures, politicians, and so on and so forth. What types of harms are involved when we recreate the deceased? We could ask these high level questions, right?
Yeah.
And then you go down way lower into these really nuanced questions. Should a child be legally allowed to interact with the deceased parent? What are the psychological effects of that? What are the ethical considerations when we start replacing loved ones with digital versions of themselves? So that's the type of back and forth that's going on. When I work with
Yeah.
legal scholars, we tend to go more on a high level. So, for instance, I'm working now on a paper that deals with consent theory. What does it mean to consent to this type of process as a person who's going to be digitally duplicated? Can I inherently consent to that? Or in the literature, often we hear this example of slavery, for instance. Is slavery a type of thing or a type of activity that one cannot, in principle, consent to, right? To giving up your own liberty. Maybe digital duplication is one of those issues or things, right? So that's a type of question we're asking there. How do you consent to something that you don't have knowledge about if these systems then go on and hallucinate or are used in multiple different ways?
Yeah.
And so we're trying to take lessons from bioethics and from sexual harassment literature and so on and so forth and see what are the parallels. Then if I'm working with metaphysicists, we're asking, what does it mean to capture an agency of an individual? What are the difficulties in that? Yeah. Is this an extended mind and so on and so forth?
Yeah. Okay. That's actually really helpful. There's a number of places I want to take the conversation. I'm just not sure which one I want to jump into. Let's start with this consent issue. Can you consent to it? Can I just ask, why couldn't I? It just seems obvious that I could be like, yeah, sure. I would think that we can consent to certain things happening to our bodies or not after we die, right? We can consent to organ transplants or not. You can harvest my organs or you cannot. We can consent to, I don't know, being buried versus being cremated. So if we can consent to our body being used, or we can donate it to scientific purposes, or so dissect and slice and dice away for the sake of scientific inquiry. You could even imagine, put me in the bodies museum, the museum with whatever one, strip me, whatever, put my central nervous system on display. I don't care. I don't know. So it seems like I can consent, it seems anyway, I can consent to all sorts of things to happen to my body. Why couldn't I just as easily, unless it's not as easy as I suppose, why couldn't I just as easily consent to, yeah, sure, create a digital duplicate of me and have at it?
Yes. So there are two different questions that we need to start off by asking. One, understanding in which circumstances consent is required. That's a general question that we need to ask, which is aside from whether we can or can't consent. Imagine, for instance, when we're dealing with historical figures. I want to create a digital duplicate of Julius Caesar, right? Consent is out of the picture here. It would be weird to ask for that. So that's an interesting question in itself. Is consent always necessary? And now as to the can I or can I not consent to it? What we want to distinguish is between the descriptive, did I or did I not consent, and the normative, is my consent valid in some sense? Now, the valid aspect of consent, there are limitations. So for instance, in bioethics, we say there are certain harms that a patient cannot consent to in principle. Their consent does not do the normative work that is supposed to be done by it.
Like what?
So
Like what?
in medical experiments, for instance, if we're using drugs that we don't know the harms that might be caused by that.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure.
So
I thought you
there
meant
are
after we die. We can't consent to certain things upon death or
right.
something.
No, so that's more or less about the living. Now, the question is, what kind of harms can happen to us after our passing? So some of the harms that I'm looking at are, for instance, related to legacy harms. Let's say I was a strong believer in peace, for instance. Okay, I'm a peace activist. And then suddenly my digital duplicate is being used to promote war, let's say, okay? So I'm being, in AI, we would call this misaligned in some sense. Then the question is, if I consented to that, is that still okay? Could I have known that this type of manipulation would have happened? So there's the knowledge question. Do I have sufficient knowledge in how these systems will be used so that my consent becomes valid or not? Then there's the hallucination problem, right? So I work a lot in the field of Holocaust remembrance. That's an area that I focus on, and specifically with context of digital duplicates. What we're trying to do there is to see how can we preserve testimonies of people who have suffered these tremendous, terrible historical events, and they've devoted a lot of their life to keeping that memory alive and telling their story. Can we use this new technology to keep that for the next generation and allow it to be highly interactive and educational? Now imagine that a Holocaust survivor suddenly is being used in a context of Holocaust denialism, right? So that's completely inappropriate. Then there are other weird issues about appropriateness. So we often talk about, for instance, asymmetric power. These companies are the ones creating these digital duplicates, and the consumers are the ones interacting with it. And the question is, what rights do the companies have? So one of the concerns is, how do we limit market pressures from becoming involved in the outputs of the digital duplicates? So imagine, for instance, you've created a duplicate of your grandmother, and you want to show it to your kids so that they have this experience of their ancestors and so on and so forth.
Sure.
And suddenly Granny remembers how she loved using Head and Shoulders shampoo. It was her favorite shampoo. Yeah. And then we discover, oh, they have some kind of ad agreement there. So all these tiny issues, right, need to come into play, and they can impact consent. So there are conditions that we usually say consent has to be involved with. Knowledge conditions, they relate to the exact use case of specificity, and so on and so forth. So those issues we're trying to understand what applies in this case and what not.
Is this the right way of thinking about it? This is so cool. Disturbing, but cool. Maybe I'm latching too much onto death. I don't know why. I'm feeling my age. But it's interesting that it seems that with consenting for people to do stuff with my body, there's a relatively limited amount of mischief that people can get up to. Whereas if I consent to, roughly speaking, my digital identity or some facsimile of me or something like that, it seems like there's a whole lot more mischief that people can get up to. Like turning a Holocaust survivor into a Holocaust denier, turning me, an ethicist, into a, I don't know, evil, twisted serial killer type character. Yeah, so is that, is that the core? Am I focused on the wrong thing?
No, not at all. I think those are absolutely important questions. How do we limit the use of these types of systems? There are also other groups of questions that can be...
Sorry, I want to hear those other group of questions, but I just want to note then that what's really interesting is that there's really deep, interesting philosophical questions about whether you can harm someone after they die, whether you can affect people's happiness or flourishing after they die. And I think a lot of people instinctively think, no, you're dead. Especially if you equate happiness with feeling good. If you're dead and you're feeling nothing, no one happiness can accrue to you. But then I think of, I used to teach this. So Aristotle thought your flourishing could be affected after you die. For instance, if your children suffer grave misfortune after you die, that makes your life worse off, even though you've been dead for a bit. And so there is a kind of instinct that your welfare or your livelihood is maybe the wrong word, your flourishing, how well your life has gone can be affected by things after you die.
Definitely. I think the most intuitive example that I can find to really clarify that kind of concern is reputational harms. So imagine you've lived a really saintly life, you've been a philanthropist, you've donated, and suddenly your whole reputation is being tarnished. You being accused of sexual harassment, you've been, you've become a modern day Weinstein. One would say, let's say those were all libels, right? They were absolute nonsense. We would say that you were harmed in some significant sense. So these reputational harms, I think people have that strong intuition that it does directly harm the person in some way, even if, their well-being, even though, they don't have a well-being to be measured at that point in time.
I think if you say they're being harmed, you've got to articulate in what way are they harmed? And if it doesn't make a ton of conceptual sense to me, maybe I'm wrong about this. Depends on what we mean by harm. But to say they're harmed, but their livelihood is not impacted, or their happiness or well-being or flourishing is not impacted anyway. I suppose you could say something like their rights have been violated, although that doesn't affect their happiness. So I wouldn't include all rights violations as harms.
Yeah, we're getting to the weeds here, right? With understanding, happiness, well-being, what is a flourishing life, what does it mean? It will depend, obviously, as you mentioned. If you're taking a Aristotelian position, then you would have a certain conception. I'm working with a legal theorist on understanding posthumous harms and what does that actually entail from a legal perspective and from a philosophical perspective. So we're wrestling around these conceptions and understanding, but it is a field that has emerged and there's a lot of literature on it already.
Yeah, I remember back in the day when I was a professor, I was also a coach for what's called the Ethics Bowl. I don't know if that means anything to you.
No.
Ethics Bowl it's kind of like a debate group or debate competition, but it's more ethics focused because it's the Ethics Bowl. And so teams debate over these ethical issues. And I was the coach for the team. And I don't remember the conclusion of what the team came to, but we discussed this one particular case about whether it's ethically permissible to publish the works of a great author posthumously, especially if that author said, don't publish this. So Kafka says, don't publish X, Y, and Z. Don't absolutely do it.
Burn it. I think he said burn it, if I remember correctly.
Okay.
I think that's what he asked, if I remember correctly.
And then did it get published or was it burned?
Yeah, it was published, of course.
It was published. Not all of his work was published. I don't know enough about Kafka.
All, just a few. Kafka is The Castle, and which was not the trial. The Castle, definitely. That was a posthumous one, but I can't remember the second one. Yeah.
So there's a really interesting question. It's at least an open question. Okay, look, maybe we should just respect his wishes and burn the material. On the other hand, suppose it's this magnificent piece of work that would greatly benefit humanity or literature lovers or something in between. And you might think, no, whatever, he's dead. Who cares? Like, he's not going to get upset about it. Let's just publish it. And then other people are going to be outraged. How dare you defy his wishes? That's a violation of his rights, even if he's not unhappy because he doesn't know it. It's still blah, blah, blah. That's so interesting that these digital duplicates questions come back to foundational questions about obligations. Under what conditions do we have obligations to people? And what impact does death have on our capacity as being rights holders?
Oh, surely. Yeah. I came across an interesting idea. They were debating exactly this question about consent and whether you can or cannot duplicate me. And what they were saying is that on autonomy grounds, we have to allow the individual to have the final word. And then they were talking about we're going to have to slowly integrate like a will-based clause where people can say, do not bot me or bot me, in their wills.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. It's funny because I've said for years, I don't care what you do with my dead body. Like, I'm not particularly religious. And I've joked, if you want to make me into a puppet, go make me into a puppet. I don't care. I'm dead. But I don't exactly have that same, apathy or, indifference towards let's create a digital duplicate of Reed and make him a Holocaust denier. That feels different to me, although I can't articulate exactly why.
So I like to use two mythical figures to highlight some of these intuitions. So I take them from Jewish folklore. But there's also more modern versions. One is called the golem. Now, the golem is like a Frankenstein-style beast, right? It's created out of clay and given will and spirit. It has no voice, but essentially it's given an order and it has a goal. It has to meet that order and goal. It has to do what its master has commanded it. And of course, the golem disobeys and becomes conscious in that sense. It starts doing whatever it wants. That's one side of the schism. The other side is called the dibuk. Now, the dibuk is the malevolent ghost that enters the body of an unsuspected victim and basically uses that body as a puppet of some kind. Sure. And I think these two ideas, the losing of control and the being manipulated as a puppet, are almost primordial fears that we have as humans. They come back throughout history, throughout all cultures almost. These ideas come back up. And with digital duplicates, it's like our modern day need to address these two really deep fears. Will I be used as a puppet? Will someone else's will come out from me and bring that out of my mouth? And there's something very invasive about that at a fundamental level. And I think that might speak to the intuition that you were saying of Reed becoming the Holocaust denier.
I wonder, so to what extent, sorry, I'm tacking between two different thoughts in my head at the same time. One is this notion of invasiveness and the boundaries of the self, right? Because you're talking about being manipulated, being under someone's control. And I think that one of the things that arguably defines what we take to be the boundaries of ourself is our sense of what's like gross and disgusting, right? The emotion of what's disgusting is what's not us. That's at least one way of characterizing it. So there are experiments like there's a lot of spit in your mouth right now, but if you were to spit into a glass and then I say, go now drink the spit, you'd be like, no, that's gross because it's been like excommunicated from your body. It's no longer part of you. So while things are inside your body, cool. But if they were to leave your body, you don't want to put them back in. Anyway, so part of this just made me think, and that's my reaction. I was thinking back to the Black Mirror episode where I just thought, I don't know, there's something about that's just gross. And maybe I'm like mixing issues here. Anyway, and then there's this sort of more philosophical thing of there's this undermining of autonomy in some broad respects of that. One thing that we really need to pay attention to in the creation of digital duplicates is whether we are undermining the autonomy of people, where part of their autonomy consists in having a right to having a right to have control over themselves, bodily or otherwise. And digital duplicates provide an opportunity to undermine their autonomy.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, to the first point, I think what comes to mind is, I don't know how familiar you are with Derek Parfit, the philosopher.
Sure, yeah.
Probably, yeah. There's this thought experiment that Parfit brings up about a transportation machine. Now, Parfit says there's this machine that'll transport you to Mars. There's a colony on Mars and you have to get there. Yeah. And you enter the machine and then your body's destroyed here and you're recreated there and all's good and dandy.
It's technically different molecules and all that, but they were arranged in exactly the same way they were on Earth.
Yeah. And the point of the thought experiment that always gets me is that, so Parfit says once the machine doesn't work properly and your body on Earth is not destroyed, and the technician comes and tells you, don't worry, in 30 minutes, your body here will die and you'll still be there in Mars.
Yeah.
And if you want, you can talk to yourself in Mars right now
Yeah.
And the way I read Parfit is by saying the moment you see yourself, again, the illusion is broken. You can't be in two places at once
Yeah.
because of the
Yeah.
self as
It's got
whole.
sure.
And
Yeah.
yeah, that really resonated with me on the first part of it. I think what we need to introduce into our discussion is that very often it's not other people creating these digital duplicates, but it's us creating it of ourselves. So a lot of
Hmm.
people out there, they're trying to create something to leave for their loved ones. Cases that I've come across, a father with ALS, a horrible disease that takes away voice and neural functions, created a digital duplicate of himself that can tell stories and sing songs to his kids.
Yeah.
So
Right.
very empowering, very beautiful, but a lot of
Yeah.
weird questions. Another case is a father who was diagnosed with terminal cancer, created a duplicate of himself in order to give advice to his kids as they grow older. So here we have an
Hmm.
interesting question. We're training these avatars, these duplicates, to represent us, to act in our place after we're gone. And the concern is, can they actually do it? And what does that actually mean? And this relates to your autonomy point. I think the word we were missing there is, or the word that I focus on a lot, is agency. And this idea of, can an algorithmic system truly capture what it means to be a full agent with a will of their own? And so a lot of my research focuses on what are those types of behaviors that cannot be understood algorithmically, that they are almost like speech acts where you have to do it in order for it to be authentic in that sense. And so the father who's trying to leave his life wisdom and advice to his kids might come across this problem in which down the line, we're always going to change. We adopt new views and new ideas. How will the avatars develop in the same way that I would have developed going down that? And we see that these two
Yeah.
start coming apart. So these are concerns that may be fundamental, right? And that's a critical work here to be done. Where should we not use these systems?
So what's the concern there that I go and create a digital duplicate of myself for the sake of whatever, sharing stories, giving advice, blah, 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 blah. And it might not go well enough such that the duplicate is not sufficiently similar to me in a way that I would approve of. Is that the worry?
No, not necessarily. That might be a concern, but I would say that's a technical problem. Maybe
Yeah,
there wasn't
right.
enough
That's what I was
data.
going to
Yeah, and
say.
so
Yep.
yeah,
Yep.
I agree with that. No, I think the fundamental concern is that a lot of our behavior and actions and choices are not derived by past patterns. They're acts of will at the moment. I'm in front of a fork in the road. Do I go left? Do I go right? A digital duplicate might be able to say, you might have gone right, you might have gone left, but that's not
Yep.
what I actually would have done at that moment. Only I can actually determine going right, going left in that sense. So
Mhm.
that's a silly example, going right, going left. We can
No,
take this
it's
to
a
more
metaphor. I get it.
fundamental.
Yeah. Okay, but so I see what you're saying, but I guess I don't know why it's a problem. There are acts of will that that a digital duplicate can't engage in because they don't have a will, because it's an echo of a will. It's not a real will. Something along those, it's a shadow of a will, something along those lines. And so what? Okay, so I create a digital duplicate of myself, recognizing that it doesn't perform genuine acts of will, recognizing that it is a shadow, it's not the real me. Okay, so what?
Yeah, that is one answer to say, I don't care. Yeah, fair enough.
Yeah,
Um,
okay.
the problem, I think, underlying that is that we don't always recognize that aspect when using these technologies, right? We're thinking that we're capturing something authentic about us, that through our past actions, we'll be able to align these values to exactly how I would have wanted to behave. I think this is a dangerous illusion, especially if we're thinking about consenting and understanding the limitations of these systems. If we understand agency as something related to acts of will, like you just mentioned now, or I was referring to, then these are aspects that can never be captured actually. So we're
Hmm.
creating that simulacra in a sense, but there's a gap between that and us. And so when we're leaving that to our children, for instance, to give them life wisdom and advice, is it actually the life wisdom and advice that I would have given in that situation, or something
Yeah,
that's close to it? And maybe that's good enough. That's fine. I'm not saying practically this is
yeah.
something that should cause us not to want to use this. I'm saying that we should know and understand ahead of using these systems that these are the types of fundamental limitations that they have. And this can go, we haven't touched about living digital duplicates. I have a colleague who wrote a paper called Xbots. And the paper Xbots tries to ask, what if we created a digital duplicate of someone who dumped us? Yeah. Our
Hmm.
partner left us. We want to continue that relationship. Let's create the duplicate and let's continue that. Well,
Yeah.
yeah, you get the point. What is the gap there? So I think, again, this touches on that fundamental gap. We're creating a version of that person, obviously diluted from their autonomy. That's one of the punchlines in paper there that they say, you think you're recreating that person, but actually you're creating a version of that person that didn't want to break up with you, which is not that person anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah, so you get where these aspects can take us and the difficulties that they can create.
Let's talk more about these living duplicates. So we spent a lot of time on the duplicates of the dead or the nearly dead. What are the kinds of things that we need to worry about in thinking about those living duplicates? One you just raised, of course, if my ex doesn't consent to my creating a digital duplicate, that's a violation of presumably something like, I guess, what do they have a right to exactly? What do they have a right to? If I say, here's what I'm thinking. She broke up with me, whatever, but in my head, I imagine all the time that we're still together and we have conversations, and those conversations are informed by past interactions that we really had. It'd be odd if she were to come up to me when she learns about this. I could see her finding out about this and being grossed out for sure. Like, that's really creepy. Get a life, loser. I get that. But I don't know that she could say, you're violating my rights by doing, or you're harming me by doing that. Especially if I'm not stalking her. I'm not doing any of those, not harassing her in any familiar way. It's all, in my head.
Yeah.
If she couldn't come up in that circumstance, why, or could she rightfully come up to me and say, I can't believe you created a digital duplicate of me. You've harmed me. You violated my rights, so on and so forth.
Yeah. So Paula Sweeney in her paper argues that it does amount to a form of harassment and stalking even. But I'm setting that aside for a second. Let's try and break it down. I think one aspect immediately we could say is data rights, right? Do you have the right to take my data and train your system on that? That might be from a legal standpoint.
Yeah, okay.
We had personal texts between us. Are you allowed to now use that to train my bot, my digital duplicate, or not? Without my...
That is fine. One distinction that I like to make is between data that's about you and your data, where the latter is a legal ownership thing. So the example that I always give here is if I walk into Cafe Martin and you're in there and you write down, Reed entered Cafe Martin at 10:30 and you write it down in your notebook. I don't have a right to go over and be like, hey, that's my data, and then rip the page out of your notebook. It's data about me, but it's not my data in any ownership sense of the term. Anyway,
sure.
We would need a
giant text
giant
message that I sent you, an email, maybe that's a vague area already. Words that I wrote to you, we might say that's more problematic.
That you own that data? Really?
At least that I would have maybe a right to complain about you misusing that in some sense. Again, take it in a different way. Let's say I sent you an intimate picture and then you posted that online.
Yeah.
We would say you've harmed me in some sense in that way.
I agree that would be a case of harm, but then my instinct, at least my gut reaction is to say, it's not the fact that it was their data as such. It's that you did something that caused them harm. People now have seen intimate photos of you, which itself constitutes a harm, a violation of privacy, blah, 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 blah. So it wouldn't be data theft that I'd be concerned with in that case. It would be the other kinds of harms that are downstream of that.
Yeah, it's definitely an issue that's debatable, but I think it's a topic that is the most obvious one that we might appeal to as one point. A second point is leaks of information. So we find that it is, unlike, let's say, I made a private shrine to read in my basement when I was praying to that shrine and giving homage to it and whatnot. In this case, it might be difficult to have it contained in the basement. So let's say I'm interacting with a digital duplicate. Am I allowed to post things online that it did? What if other people become aware of these interactions? So with these types of cases, the types of interactions might leak out and cease to be private. Now, again, if you say to me in your privacy of your own home, no one knows about it, it's only me, is that significantly different from making a doll and pretending that this is my ex? Maybe not.
Right.
I don't know. But it's a slippery slope in that sense. It's far easier for things to come out and for that to then cause harm. So that might be an area where I might have a claim to say, you're doing something that's almost inflicting on my personal autonomy in that sense. What is really interesting, I think, is that all these areas need to be discussed and debated. And why I mentioned at the beginning that deepfakes are the only thing that's getting attention while all these others aren't. And now we're seeing all the vagueness that comes up here and how if these technologies become predominant and widespread, we're going to have to adjust to it very much. Now, that might be legally, but it could be also with social norms. I didn't raise you to have an AI girlfriend, something I tell my kids.
These are very big issues. So where do we go now? Do you think we have to go one by one? We have to go, all right, so look, let's think about digital duplicates. for grief. Let's think about it when it's your ex. Let's think about it for do we have to go case by case here? And then we have to proceed by, as it were, ethical common law or case law? Are we supposed to try to, I don't know, listen, Reed, these are the three principles I really think that we should develop digital duplicates in line with. How do we make progress here?
Yeah, there are obviously more common use cases and more fringe cases, and we'll have to pay more attention to those common ones. So grief bots, as we mentioned, is a big thing. There are a
Yeah.
lot of companies that are zeroing in on what's known as the digital afterlife industry, and it's become an industry. There are a lot of very powerful players that are entering that arena, a lot of money. So that's an area that's going to be slowly regulated, and we're going to have to look into that. So that's one aspect of it. Then on the business side, there's a lot of use cases there. We didn't talk about those, but for instance, there's the CEO of Zoom, Eric Yuan. He came out with this big declaration. Each one of us will have our own digital duplicate to go to meetings for us so that we can do what's really important in life, which is go to the beach, in his example. And recently he created a digital avatar of himself and sent it to the quarterly earnings meeting of the shareholders to give the presentation instead of him.
Yeah.
But it was more of a gimmick to show off the technology.
Yeah, sure.
But yeah, so business applications, there'll be a lot. And they're completely different set of questions. Some of the issues are coming up is, do we have a right to a human contact as consumers, for instance? Do I have a right to receive an explanation from a decision that was automatically created and so on? So yeah, that might be one strategy to go to the big use cases. Maybe I can go over some of the attempts to taxonomize these different aspects, and then we could see like the different approaches.
Yeah.
So one type of attempt was to try and do this from a functional perspective, try and ask what are the different functions of these duplicates. On the one side, we'd have like cognitive duplicates that would be maybe personal assistants. They would be they would replace you. So one example they discussed there is, for instance, an author who is about to pass away, but hasn't finished his last book and really wants to get it done. So he writes like a synopsis or an outline to it and then gives it to his duplicate to finish the book. Yeah. And so those will be like cognitive duplicates in his style to create that. And then on the other side, we would have audiovisual duplicates for interactive purposes. That's one way to go, functionality. Another is through motivation. So some have talked about, are these meant for legacy? Are these meant for relationships? Are these meant for extending our experiences? That's another way to taxonomize this. My sort of approach has been to try and offer a very high level conceptualization. So I've looked at only two criteria: consent and whether the duplicate is imitating a living or deceased person. And then you get basically four categories. And then what I do in a recent paper is go through each of those four categories and talk about the different ethical considerations that might arise in those cases. So that's been my approach to this. Ultimately, and this is a long answer to a difficult question, I think we'll have to go case by case. I think it's unavoidable to examine each specific instance because they'll raise specific challenges. There's been one attempt to offer a framework to do that. I don't know if you want to go into those details, but they've offered like a principle with conditions that you can then measure each instance along those conditions to see how they meet. And
we don't have to go into the details of that in particular, but I'd be interested in reading the paper perhaps. But I think there's going to have to be at some point some fairly clear legal principles, because the law I don't think it can just go case by case, or I guess there could be established case law, but that'll take a while to set up. I have to imagine that there's going to be a push for things like a right to your digital duplicate or something along those lines. And so that no one would have the right to create a digital duplicate of you. If they did, they'd be in violation of the law, even if you're dead, blah, blah, blah. So I feel like there's got to be that kind of right that gets enshrined in the law. And that would apply whether you're living or dead.
Yeah, I mean, we've seen now there's been just last week, I think in Denmark, they came out with a new copyright law to say that each individual has ownership over their own image, so that any type of deepfake of a person would be copyright infringement under their legal system. Yeah, it's a very aggressive approach that I guess in the US wouldn't be adopted. But definitely there'll be a lot more clarity in the next years over these regulations. But I assume that there will be a lot of vagueness in that still. And this is one of the points that we are working on. It's called legal indeterminacy, so that the law often leaves a lot of discretion in place for the society to just not to make its own normative choices on a lot of these different applications. And I'm assuming that many of these issues will remain there. Of course, there'll be consent issues will come up, but we're seeing this is fluid, even in those fields that we feel that have been adjudicated Like in sexual harassment, that's changing often.
Yeah.
We just saw this week with alcohol, there was a decision by a court that any intake of alcohol nullifies consent. You don't need to be in an extreme position, but that any type of drinking at all can be grounds for saying there was no consent for sexual relation. This is constantly being harder or softer or stricter or more lenient in these respects. So I assume it'll be similar in that sense.
I could see a world in which this is all part of our will, our last will and testament, that sort of thing. I relatively recently went through the process of creating the will and preferences around when I would be resuscitated versus just left. And I can imagine the same kind of questionnaire being given to me about how I want my data or my digital identity or blah, blah, blah to be, what I consent to and what I don't. And that being, I don't know, that kind of thing governing what can and cannot be done.
Yeah, I mean, that's something that makes sense. I mentioned the do not bot me clause idea that they brought up. That would cover some of the issues, but of course, a lot of the issues are in a different nature. People will actively create their own duplicate, and that in and of itself might cause certain problems, not only in the case where it's done to me.
And I also want to mention before we close out, there was that recent case in the U.S. court where the person who was dead, a digital duplicate of the murdered person, testified, I think on behalf of the accused is that right?
So the case was Christopher Pelkey.
Yeah.
And he was killed in a road rage situation, murdered by a person. And then at the sentencing, after the trial was over, the judge allowed the family to bring a digital duplicate of Christopher to give his own victim statement. Now, if you see the video, it's very strange. So what you can find online is Christopher, and you can see the judge's reaction as well. Both videos are available online. Now, Christopher essentially, the avatar of Christopher is speaking, and it's very anthropomorphized. So it's constantly saying, I want to thank you, I, and the first. But the family wrote the script, of course. It's his sister who wrote it. And then the judge's reaction is very weird. He seems very moved by it. And he uses very strange phrasings like, I feel so that I can see that you allowed Christopher to speak what is in his heart as you saw it. So it's mind-boggling almost to understand what was going on there. Very strange situation. And we're seeing this in the legal system appearing. There are no hard rules yet as to whether this is acceptable or not. I find that an egregious use case, personally. And this goes back to this idea of the Diebuk, right? Christopher did not write those words. They're assuming that because he had certain Christian beliefs, he would be pro-forgiveness in this. Which might be correct. It might not also.
Or he might have been like, it's like Mike Tyson, everyone's got a plan to get punched in the face. He's actually, I just got murdered, so burn this guy alive.
Yeah, what the duplicate says there to the accused, right, to the murderer. In other circumstances, we could have been friends. It's a very strong thing to say, right?
Yeah. Oh, man. Thank you so much. This is a total ethical minefield, ethical legal minefield.
Definitely. And that's why it's so interesting, I think, for a philosopher to work there. There's so many open questions. And so it leaves so much room to think creatively. Maybe I want to end with one comment just. I think whenever we deal with these types of technologies, I try to make very clear that I distinguish between philosophy and policy. So I think we have to philosophize about this as much as possible and push it to the extreme. What if, and can we do this and that? But when it comes to policy, I think we need to be way more risk averse. I think there are a lot of harms that can come up from these technologies, and we need to be extremely careful. What's going on with companies is a lot of marketing deception that can cause people in very vulnerable situations a lot of harms. So there, I'm very risk averse, even though I love philosophizing about this and discussing it. So it's wearing those two hats. And I think we need to be very clear about that.
Yeah. Super interesting. All right. When, do some more work on this stuff and you'll have to come back and talk more about it. It's great stuff.
Yeah. Thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
No, thank you. Thanks, everyone, for listening. I hope you enjoyed the episode, and I want to thank a few people who make this all possible. Delano Alexander, he's my producer. He does such an amazing job on everything that he touches. Garrett Lang is the sound engineer. That's honestly, he's too good for me. Athmia Jairam has joined us recently. He's helping us find the best guests to bring onto this podcast. And Ashley Wassilenko helps us organize all this, get people on the schedule, get people's bios, headshots, and really keeps the train on the track. So thanks, guys. Really appreciate all the hard work you do.